In just 19 seconds, it happened. J.D. Vance, Marine senator, son of a broken steel town, sat under the searing lights of a Capitol News studio, live on national television. Jasmine Crockett, razor-sharp and unfiltered, turned to him with a smirk that could slice through glass, and said something no one expected. It wasn't just personal, it was surgical, and in front of 6 million Americans, it could have broken him. But what J.D. said next didn't just silence Jasmine Crockett. It made Congress sit up. It made headlines hold their breath. And it left a nation asking one question: can a single sentence turn a national insult into a legacy? This story is based on public figures, but the confrontation, the emotions, the fallout you're about to witness, they've been dramatized to reflect a deeper truth. Because even when the characters are fictionalized, the pain, the power, and the rise, they're all real. Let's begin. Stay with us, because when silence speaks louder than insult, every second matters. The studio was freezing cold, like they kept the air conditioning at full blast just to keep the guests uncomfortable. J.D. Vance sat still under the glow of 4 studio lights, their heat pressing into his blazer while the air bit at the back of his neck. He didn't shiver, but he felt it. Every inch of him felt it. To his right, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't seem fazed. She leaned slightly forward in her chair, her expression unreadable, her nails drumming lightly on the polished glass table. The edge of her lipstick matched her blazer, sharp, defiant red. She looked ready, more than ready, like she had the opening line already loaded, and it was meant to pierce. 30 seconds, the floor director called out, her voice cutting through the low murmur in the control booth. J.D.'s mic crackled in his ear. He adjusted his collar but didn't look away from the middle of the table. From the corner of his eye, he could see the camera crane lowering, its lens hovering just over them like a hawk about to strike. Crockett's team had arrived early. They'd mic-checked twice, adjusted her lighting, even swapped out her chair for one she preferred. J.D. had arrived on time, alone, no entourage, carrying a notebook half filled with notes scribbled at 1:30 a.m. in a motel outside D.C. No teleprompter, no handlers, just memory. 15 seconds. Across the table, Crockett turned slightly toward him, not enough for the cameras to notice, but just enough to lock eyes. She didn't smile. Her look said, "You're not ready for me." J.D. didn't flinch, but he did blink. Once, slowly. Going live. In 5. The countdown in his ear started. 4, 3, 2. The studio lights flared. The floor beneath his shoes vibrated slightly as the live feed surged through the cables into millions of American homes. And just like that, they were no longer 2 people sitting in a room. They were symbols, archetypes, battle lines drawn across a glass table. J.D. had been on air before, but never like this. Not with someone who walked in already half lioness, half lawyer. Jasmine's reputation had grown in recent months, fearless on the mic, merciless with her words, and surgical in how she dismantled her opponents. Clips of her takedowns had racked up millions of views, sound bites, smirks, slow blinks, before she dropped the line that made the studio go silent. She didn't debate, she dismantled. And tonight, J.D. was the one strapped in across from her. The host smiled into the camera, began her polished welcome. Tonight, we bring together 2 powerful voices, Senator J.D. Vance and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, to discuss the future of economic equity in America. J.D. barely heard her. His focus had tunneled in. He saw Crockett's hand inch toward her mic. He saw her breath hitch slightly. She was about to go first. And he knew whatever she said, it wouldn't be neutral. It would be surgical. And she would be aiming for the throat. What was she going to lead with? Appalachia, his book, his time with Trump, or worse, his upbringing, the trailer park, the pills, the steel town that people like her only saw in headlines? He wasn't afraid, but something inside him braced. Then she spoke. "Senator Vance," she said smoothly, her voice already carrying a razor hidden in silk. "You've talked a lot about pain, your poverty, your past. But tell me honestly, at what point does storytelling become strategy?" J.D. didn't answer right away, because deep down, He already knew. This wasn't a conversation. It was a minefield. And the first step had just been taken. The first question was gentle, by design. Something about federal funding distribution and bipartisan proposals for infrastructure reform. JD answered first, carefully, firmly, as if easing into cold water. He spoke of neglected towns, broken bridges, and bureaucratic blind spots. Jasmine nodded as he spoke. At least, it looked like a nod. But there was something in the way her head tilted, just slightly off-center, like she was listening not for substance, but for the moment he gave her an opening. Then it came. "Well," she said, her voice measured, each syllable polished and ready for prime time, "it's refreshing to hear a man talk about community instead of committee votes. But Senator, if I may, men like you often come with stories, but rarely with solutions." She smiled. It was wide and brilliant and not meant to comfort. JD didn't blink. He knew that tone. It wasn't an insult delivered head-on. It was the kind that drifted into the bloodstream slowly, like a toxin. He could feel the camera turning toward him again, catching whatever flicker might cross his face. But there was none. Only breath, only quiet. He leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on the table. Not clenched, not defensive. Just there. Honest. "I don't mind being called a storyteller," he said steady, "because the stories I tell, they're real. I didn't grow up on the hill. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio, in a house where the kitchen sink leaked and the heat didn't always work. My mom worked nights at a diner. My grandma raised me on expired coupons and expired hope. I still remember the sound of her heels on the linoleum floor at 5 a.m., leaving for her shift after watching me sleep on the couch." He paused, not for effect, but because the memory was still real enough to sting. "Stories are how people like us survive," he added quietly. "They remind us we matter, even when the system says we don't." There it was. A moment, small, unpolished, true, and Jasmine saw it. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms slowly. The host turned to her, about to pivot to a new topic, but Jasmine wasn't done. She looked directly at JD, not aggressively but deliberately, and then spoke, softer this time, but not gentler. "Your poverty is a brand, Senator." The words hung in the air like smoke. "You built a career dressing up struggle, sold it, packaged it, got it blurbed by people who'd never set foot in your old neighborhood. You turned pain into politics, and now here you are, sitting in a suit, telling stories again while people are still waiting for change." The room didn't move. Not a camera, not a sound tech, not a breath. It was a masterstroke, brilliant in its restraint, brutal in its construction. It wasn't just a jab. It was a slow, precision-guided cut, meant not to injure immediately, but to echo, to question his authenticity, to make the audience wonder, was J.D. Vance just another man who learned to cry on cue? J.D. didn't answer right away, because the answer wouldn't be made with words. Not yet. He sat still, the studio lights hot again on his face, and deep inside, a quiet decision settled in his chest. Not to fight back with fire, but with something far more dangerous. Clarity, and he was almost ready. The host cleared her throat, tried to pivot. Something about tax credits, something forgettable. But nobody was listening anymore. Not in the studio, not behind the cameras, and certainly not in the millions of living rooms tuned in across America. The moment had already shifted. The air inside the studio had thickened, slowed. JD could feel it pressing against his ribs. Jasmine Crockett wasn't looking at the host. She hadn't moved her eyes from JD since she delivered her last line. Calm, cutting, and composed. She looked like someone who had just landed a clean punch and knew exactly where it landed. But she wasn't finished. "You know what I think, Senator?" she said, still smiling. Her voice as smooth as it had been since minute one. "I think you're the hillbilly they let in, so they can pretend to be inclusive." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sneer. She didn't even blink. But the entire panel stopped moving. Even the soundboard tech, halfway through adjusting a mic level, froze with his hand on the fader. A junior producer in the corner dropped her clipboard. A camera operator visibly shifted his stance like something dangerous had just stepped into the room. For 3 seconds, there was nothing but silence. Not empty silence, but electric silence. The kind that doesn't wait for a reply. It demands one. JD didn't move at first. His right hand remained on the table, his fingertips resting against the cool edge of a ceramic coffee cup. He could hear his own pulse in his ear, matched with the faint buzz of the studio lights. Jasmine had aimed for blood, but what surprised him wasn't the insult itself. It was how casually it had been said, as if it wasn't even meant to be cruel, as if it was just truth wrapped in confidence. He glanced down, not in defeat, but in calculation. He stared at the surface of the table, at the faint reflection of himself in the polished glass. He saw the man they were watching, the former Marine, the author, the senator in a charcoal gray suit. But he also saw someone else, the kid from Middletown, fists clenched at bus stops, watching his mother scream into the void. The boy who used to sleep on a mattress with busted springs and dream of nothing louder than being taken seriously. He looked up. Not at the host, not at the camera, but directly at Jasmine. And then he spoke, not quickly, not forcefully, but clearly, like someone who had finally chosen not to flinch. "I'd rather be a hillbilly who remembers his roots," he said, his voice even, his face unreadable, "than a suit who forgot hers." No dramatics, no raised voice, just the words. And the room reacted. The host blinked, caught between shock and sudden awareness. One of the panelists to JD's left shifted uncomfortably. Crockett's fingers tapped once on the table, then stopped. Outside the studio, 1,000 remote controls paused mid-click. Someone on Twitter clipped the moment before JD even finished his sentence. The silence returned, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. And in that breathless space, the line had landed. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest, because it was simple, and because in one unshaken breath, JD Vance had just done what no one expected. He had answered, not with a counterpunch, but with memory, and the echo of it had already begun. The door clicked shut behind Jasmine Crockett before the credits had even finished rolling. Her aides moved like a well-practiced machine, one holding her coat, another guiding her shoulder, a third already on the phone. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The cameras were off. The kill shot had landed. As far as her team was concerned, the moment was sealed. JD Vance stayed seated. The studio lights were dim now, leaving only the dull overhead fluorescence that made everything look colder, flatter, more sterile. A production assistant walked past him without saying a word, dropping a clipboard onto a folding table nearby. Someone coughed behind a curtain. The hum of equipment started to fill the void left by applause that had never come. He exhaled slowly, still not angry, just alert. The green room wasn't green. It was beige and fluorescent, with a fake ficus plant in the corner and a sagging leather couch that smelled faintly of nervous sweat and old cologne. JD sat alone, back straight, hands folded. He hadn't touched the bottled water beside him. He hadn't moved since he walked in. A flat-screen TV bolted to the wall replayed the final 3 minutes of the segment. There it was again. The smirk, the line, the reaction. He watched himself in third person, sitting still as the insult landed, eyes flicking downward, then rising to deliver the line that hadn't been written anywhere in his notes. "I'd rather be a hillbilly who remembers his roots than a suit who forgot hers." It played again, this time with the chyron beneath. Senator. Vance claps back. "I remember my roots." He hated that word. Clap back. Like it was all performance. Like the lives behind the words were just props in a louder argument. But that's how it would be sliced, captioned, spun, and spit out onto 1,000 phones by morning. The door opened a crack. A staffer poked his head in, maybe mid-20s, lanyard swinging from his neck, hair slightly disheveled, like he just realized who he was standing near. "Senator?" he said, cautious. You okay?" JD didn't answer right away. He looked at the kid who looked like he wasn't sure whether to offer water or backup. JD gave a small nod. Not yes. Not no. Just enough to send the kid back into the hallway with a silent breath of relief. He turned back to the screen. They were looping it now. The insult, the camera cut to his face, the pause, the reply. There was something strange about watching your own restraint become a spectacle. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes narrowed. What got to him most wasn't the word itself. It wasn't even the laughter he thought he heard from the camera crew when the mics cut. It was how familiar it all felt. The assumption, the shorthand, the certainty with which someone like Jasmine Crockett could use a word like hillbilly and expect it to be dismissed as clever, not cruel. He'd been hearing that tone his entire life, not always in words, sometimes in the way teachers graded papers, or the way a college recruiter looked past his handshake, or the way big donors flinched slightly when he mentioned his hometown. That tone didn't surprise him, but it had followed him here, to a seat in the U.S. Senate, to national television, to the green room of a show watched by millions. He sat back, eyes fixed on the looping footage. Not hurt, not humiliated, just reminded. And that kind of reminder doesn't fade. It settles in and waits. By the time JD made it back to his hotel, the clip had already crossed 1 million views. Not the whole debate, not even the insult itself, just the moment after. That frozen second when JD looked down, then back up, and delivered his reply, quiet, controlled, unscripted. Someone had clipped it with music, slow motion effect, and a caption that read, "When silence hits harder than words." Another version had spliced it between reactions of audience gasps from old reality shows, turning it into something halfway between drama and meme. He sat on the edge of the bed in his room, blazer unbuttoned, tie slightly loosened. The TV played a local weather segment with the sound muted. His phone buzzed every 10 seconds. Mentions, retweets, articles. Notifications flooded in, not because people were praising him, but because everyone had an opinion and no one agreed. Some of the top comments under the original clip read, "He froze. Weak. That wasn't a comeback. That was a retreat. She told the truth and he couldn't handle it." Others came to his defense. "He didn't need to yell. That's real strength. This is what dignity looks like under pressure." Funny how people hate silence more than insults. But the loudest voices weren't defending or attacking. They were dissecting. His pause was rehearsed. He's weaponizing humility. He's rebranding trauma for power again. It didn't matter that JD hadn't tweeted, or posted, or said anything since the show. The internet had already built a dozen versions of him, each more contradictory than the last. Then came the tweet. Just one, simple white text on a black background. He didn't clap back. He made us think. No hashtags, no account tag. Just that. It wasn't even from a political page. Just a woman in Ohio. Profile picture, a school classroom. Bio, mom, teacher, tired. It had less than 400 followers, and yet it spread like wildfire. Within an hour, it had been shared by authors, columnists, veterans groups, and even a pastor from Georgia who added, "I saw that stare in my father's eyes when he came back from war." JD read the tweet again, then slowly put his phone face down on the nightstand. He didn't smile. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt observed, not understood, just watched. There was something hollow about going viral for restraint. The world was spinning around a moment that hadn't been planned, hadn't been packaged, hadn't even been meant to resonate. It was just him, pausing, thinking, holding back. And now it was being parsed like scripture. He turned off the lamp beside him. For a moment, the room was completely dark, but the glow of the TV screen still lit the edges of the ceiling. On mute, a pundit was pointing at his own panel, lips moving in rhythm, probably saying something about JD's tone or optics or strategy, probably using words like authenticity or damage control or working-class brand management. JD closed his eyes. He hadn't planned to go viral. He had just chosen not to flinch. And somehow, that was now the story. Or worse, the battlefield. The phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a journalist or an aide or a headline alert. It was just Mom. JD let it ring twice before answering. Not because he didn't want to pick up. He always answered when she called. but because he knew instinctively that she already knew. "Hey," he said softly. She didn't respond at first, just breathed into the line, like she was still deciding what part of the country her voice needed to reach. Then, "They see what they want, son." JD closed his eyes. She wasn't mad. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't even curious about what had happened. Because like all mothers who raise their sons through storms, she didn't need to watch a broadcast to know what the world had done with her boy. "But your story," she continued, "is still yours. No matter how many people retweet their version." JD leaned back against the headboard, the cheap motel lamp casting a triangle of gold onto the ceiling. He knew the smell of that lamp's dust. It reminded him of the trailer back in Middletown, of nights when the electricity flickered and they lit candles, not because it was romantic, but because it was the only option. "I didn't expect it to blow up like this," he said, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "No one ever expects a scar to become a flag," she replied. That made him pause. She hadn't been poetic when he was a kid. She was practical. Worn fingers, long shifts, no tolerance for pity. But now her voice held the kind of gravity that only comes when you've lived long enough to know that truth doesn't always roar. It lingers. JD didn't speak for a while. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was familiar. It was the same kind of silence they'd shared when he was 17, and he'd come home from working the line with his hands cracked and raw, collapsing into the one chair in the kitchen that didn't wobble. The same silence when he read a dog-eared copy of Mice and Men under a broken lamp, mouthing the words to himself like they were spells that might fix something. He remembered the way she'd peek in from the hallway, still in her work scrubs, not interrupting, just watching, proud but quiet about it. Back then, he didn't have cameras. He didn't have microphones. He had dirt under his fingernails and a bruised knuckle from a stripped bolt, and the nagging feeling that if he ever got out, he'd be expected to leave his story behind to be taken seriously. Now here he was, national TV, a senator, a target. "Don't let them frame it," she said finally. "You don't need to fight back. You just need to speak forward." That line stuck with him long after she hung up. No press release, no rebuttal drafted by interns, no half-hearted apology or media spin about misinterpretation. None of that would matter. The truth wasn't supposed to be managed. It was supposed to be told. He looked across the motel room. His laptop sat on the desk, closed but waiting, the glow from his phone screen dimmed to black in his palm. JD stood, walked over, and opened the computer. He didn't need a speech. He just needed a connection. And for once, he wasn't going to try to impress or convince or respond. He was going to remember. And then, he was going to speak. It wasn't polished. It wasn't planned. It wasn't supposed to go viral. That's what made it real. JD Vance didn't drive to a studio. He didn't fix his collar or wait for golden hour. He simply unlocked the side door to his mother's garage, flipped on the old fluorescent light, and let the past come rushing in. The same garage where he'd helped his uncle change brake pads when he was 13. The same garage that still smelled faintly of gasoline, laundry detergent, and wood dust from a broken shelf that had never been fixed. Everything was still where it used to be, or close enough. The lawn chairs stacked in the corner, a cracked toolbox with rusted hinges, the same concrete floor stained with oil and time. He set the laptop on top of a dusty milk crate. No ring light, no microphone, just the front-facing camera and whatever daylight managed to push through the old blinds. He sat on an overturned paint bucket and looked straight into the lens. For a moment, he didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty. It was earned. Then he said softly but clearly, "You called it branding. I call it survival." He let the sentence hang, exactly like it had hung in his chest for hours. "I've heard a lot of noise in the last 24 hours. Most of it not surprising, some of it personal. And maybe that's what hurts most. Not because I'm offended, but because I've heard it all before." His eyes flicked sideways for half a breath, as if watching memory itself flicker in the air. "I remember being 13 and walking into school with hand-me-down jeans that didn't fit. The knees were already worn out. The soles of my shoes were glued back on with something from under the sink. And I remember someone behind me whispering the word trash." He let out a soft exhale. half breath, half release. Not because they knew me, not because they saw me, but because they had already decided who I was based on what I wore, based on where I lived, based on what they thought struggle was supposed to look like. He paused, leaned forward slightly. So no, it's not branding when I talk about where I come from. It's not strategy. It's not spin. It's memory. It's reality. It's what shaped me before I ever set foot in a courtroom or held a microphone. A single fly buzzed near the light above him. He didn't look away. I didn't come here to defend myself, because honestly, I don't have to. I came here to remind anyone watching that where you come from, whatever name they put on it, doesn't disqualify you from having a voice. He tapped the side of the crate gently. A soft thump echoed against the concrete. This place, this garage, this is where I learned how to work, how to listen, how to fix something when it was broken, not with money, but with your own hands and time. That's not a story I packaged. It's the only story I've ever had. He looked into the camera, quiet now, still. And if being honest about that makes me a target, I can live with that, because I've lived through worse. He didn't add music. He didn't end with a tagline. He just reached forward and hit stop. And somewhere in the dust, beneath the hum of the light and the ache of old tools, a different kind of message had already begun to move. One that didn't need volume. Only truth. The video went up at 8:12 a.m. Eastern. No hashtags, no links, no headline. Just a quiet post on J.D. Vance's personal page titled, "From Where I Started." For the first hour, almost nothing happened. A few shares, a few likes, one comment from a woman in Kentucky. I watched this twice. Once for you, once for me. By mid-morning, something shifted. The algorithm didn't make it go viral. The people did. A former factory foreman in Indiana posted it with the caption, "This is the first time I've heard someone talk like me on camera and not sound ashamed." A retired veteran in West Texas wrote, "Reminds me of my father. Strong because he had no other option. A single mom in Tennessee. He just described my kitchen, my bills, my kids' shoes. I'm crying." They didn't write in capital letters. They didn't shout, but the tone was unmistakable. Recognition. Not political, not partisan, just real. Somewhere between lunch breaks and loading docks, the video began to spread not like a wildfire, but like something gentler, a memory passed hand to hand. Then came the teachers. One posted a screenshot of her laptop with the caption, "Using this in class today. This is what dignity looks like." Another replied underneath, "My seniors are writing essays. What's the value of where you come from? Haven't seen them this quiet in months." An educator in Milwaukee added, "Had a student say, 'I didn't know senators could talk like that.'" Now we're talking about voice, not volume. It wasn't just the blue-collar workers or middle America teachers. It was the quiet majority who rarely commented. The kind of people who didn't join hashtags or flame wars. People who had watched the insult unfold on live TV and said nothing until they saw the garage, the oil stains, the paint bucket, the pause between sentences. And suddenly, they had something to say. A woman in her 60s, profile picture of a church group, wrote, "My husband was a welder for 40 years. No one ever asked him how he got through it. But this man, he just told that story for him." A teenager from Baltimore posted on TikTok, "This hit harder than any politician yelling. It's the quiet ones who carry weight." By late afternoon, the video had passed 3 million views. But it wasn't trending. It was traveling, organically, person to person, group chat to group chat, inbox to inbox. JD sat at the same motel desk where he'd uploaded it just hours earlier. The notifications were endless now. Not likes or algorithms, but stories. Hundreds of them. Typed quickly, sometimes with typos, sometimes with photos attached. Kitchens, toolboxes, calloused hands, report cards pinned to fridges. They weren't responding to his politics. They were responding to his memory. And somehow, through the noise and the doubt and the clipped headlines from the day before, something unexpected had happened. He hadn't fought back. He had spoken forward. And now other people were finding their own voices through his, not as a movement, not as a campaign, just as a quiet turn toward truth. The motel room was quiet now. The buzz of his phone had slowed. The daylight outside the thin curtain had shifted into that pale, late-afternoon gold, the kind that makes even cheap carpets look almost warm. J.D. Vance sat in the same chair by the desk, legs crossed at the ankle, half-finished coffee going cold beside him. He wasn't scrolling anymore. He was just reading. No media requests, no interviews scheduled. Just story after story from strangers who somehow didn't feel like strangers anymore. Then one message caught him. No blue check mark, no profile photo, just a first name, Caleb. No punctuation in the subject line. Just, I thought you should know. JD clicked it open. I'm 23, from Logan County, West Virginia. My dad worked in the mines till they closed, and my mom worked nights cleaning offices. We don't talk politics in my house, ever. We don't think it's for people like us. But I watched your garage video at 1 a.m., and something changed. You didn't yell. You didn't lie. You just said it plain. I thought politics wasn't for people like us. But you made me rethink that. Just wanted to say thanks. JD reread it once, then again. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, as if a reply might be appropriate, but he didn't type. Instead, he leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, mouth barely open as he whispered to no one in particular. That's why I showed up. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a line built for sound bites. It was the kind of sentence a person says only when they hear something they forgot they needed. He had done dozens of interviews, written op-eds, delivered floor speeches, but none of those moments ever made him stop like this one message from a 23-year-old with no punctuation and a cracked screen phone probably held together with tape. He looked around the room, the scuffed table, the coffee stain on the curtain, the broken remote duct taped together. Everything about the space screamed temporary. But this message, this feeling, it stuck because it reminded him that not every conversation needs a podium. Not every message needs a mic. Some of the most important things are said quietly, in lowercase letters, in private corners of inboxes that most senators never check themselves. He thought of Caleb, maybe sitting in a dim room just like this one, wondering if his words would even be read, wondering if someone like J.D. Vance would care. And the truth was, he did, more than he knew how to say. Because Caleb wasn't just thanking J.D. for a video. He was handing him proof that someone out there still believes dignity matters. That truth, told plainly, without armor or polish, still has a place in the world of microphones and agendas. J.D. closed the laptop gently. He didn't need a press conference. Not today. Today, that was the headline. And for once, he didn't feel the need to add anything more. The silence didn't last long. Less than 36 hours after J.D. Vance's garage video began quietly making its way through classrooms, living rooms, and break rooms, Jasmine Crockett reappeared, polished, poised, and perfectly lit, live on MSNBC. The background was crisp, bookshelves, framed legislation, the flag just slightly out of focus. She wore navy, not red this time, her voice calm, but laced with precision. I've seen the video, she said, leaning into the camera, and I want to be clear. Don't let one soft-spoken monologue fool you. J.D. Vance is still part of the problem. The anchor gave the obligatory raised eyebrow, the nonverbal cue of permission to go on. Crockett did. He's trying to reframe the conversation, she continued, and I get it. It's a clever move. Talk about growing up poor in a garage. Skip the part about supporting policies that hurt the very communities he claims to come from. JD wasn't named in the segment title, but he didn't have to be. The chyron beneath her read, Senators' Viral Video Sparks Class Debate, and Twitter lit up before the segment ended. She didn't yell. She didn't insult him directly, but the words were engineered to wound. Headlines followed within hours. Vance weaponizes sympathy. Can struggle be marketed? From grit to grift, the politics of poverty. Is J.D. Vance playing the victim or playing the game? Cable panels dissected her phrasing. Some agreed. Others bristled. A clip of Crockett saying, "The garage doesn't change the vote," was reposted thousands of times, some with applause emojis, others with angry rebuttals. The divide deepened. JD didn't respond, at least not immediately, but the segment cut through the air like a cold wind. And for Crockett, it served its purpose. Remind America who she was, that she wasn't going to let a man reclaim moral ground by sitting on a paint bucket and talking about hardship. Her team followed the appearance with a thread on X, formerly Twitter, outlining JD's voting record, healthcare policies, education cuts, campaign donations. A quick video edited together shots of JD speaking calmly over somber piano music, while bold red letters overlaid facts. Voted against school meal expansion. Opposed minimum wage increase. Silent on key labor protections. It was polished, powerful, and persuasive. But something in the tone had shifted. While Crockett's words resonated with some, others felt something subtle but real. The weight of the attack. A teacher in rural Ohio posted, "I've voted Democrat my whole life, but this feels like we're yelling at the wrong thing." A factory worker wrote, "I don't know who's right anymore, but I know what it feels like to be talked over." The political class was watching, calculating. JD's silence had started a conversation. Jasmine's rebuttal had restarted the war. And somewhere in that collision, between authenticity and narrative, between microphone and memory, America found itself not choosing sides, but choosing tone. Because this wasn't just about who was right anymore. It was about who was still listening, and who was speaking loudest just to stay heard. The invitation disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. It had been a small thing, an email, forwarded from an aide, with a subject line that simply read, "Joint Committee on Workforce Equity, confirmed participants." JD's name had been on the original list. 3 days later, without explanation, it wasn't. No formal notice, no statement, just gone. At first, JD assumed it was a scheduling mistake. Maybe the staff had shuffled things. Maybe someone higher up changed the structure. But then came the hallway conversation, one of those whispered check-ins where the real message is hidden inside the pause. "We need someone less divisive." That's how they phrased it. Less divisive, not less honest, not less clear, just less likely to make people uncomfortable. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't have to. This wasn't punishment in the traditional sense. No scolding, no headlines, no one stripping titles or demanding apologies. This was the other kind of punishment, the one that moves like cold air under a locked door. You don't see it, but you feel it. Meetings suddenly filled up without him. Schedules clashed. Staffers who used to greet him with small talk now kept their eyes glued to phones. A senator he'd collaborated with on a veterans' health care bill now waved from across the room, but didn't approach. A policy draft he'd been co-sponsoring was suddenly under review. Nothing overt, everything intentional. He sat through a strategy meeting that afternoon, white walls, long table, 15 faces around it, all talking at once. No one said anything about the MSNBC segment. No one said anything about the garage video either. They talked about midterm optics, swing state polling, immigration framing, tax messaging. JD listened, took notes, didn't speak. Halfway through, someone cracked a joke about cultural overcorrection and got a polite chuckle from the room. JD didn't laugh. Instead, he closed his notepad, slid it into his coat pocket, stood up, and walked out. Quietly, cleanly. No dramatic exit. Just one less body in a room full of people who still thought they could steer the narrative from behind polished oak doors. Out in the hallway, he didn't head for the elevator right away. He walked slowly, letting the hush of Capitol carpeting absorb his footsteps. He passed interns rushing with coffee, staffers whispering over folders, a janitor humming faintly as he polished the brass railings. It struck JD as he walked how none of this felt surprising. He'd grown up learning that institutions protect themselves first, that you can serve truth on a silver platter and someone will still call it a threat if it rattles their reflection. And now, without saying a word out loud, the system had sent its message. Blend in, or be removed, one door at a time. JD reached the glass doors at the end of the hallway and paused. Outside, the winter sky had shifted to slate gray. The Capitol dome stood silent, like it always did, majestic, immovable, and somehow disconnected. He didn't press the door open just yet. He stood there a little longer, letting the weight of what wasn't said settle in. It didn't feel like defeat. It felt like confirmation. And somewhere beneath that quiet, a different kind of resolve began to rise. One that no committee invitation, or lack of one, could erase. The chapel wasn't grand. It sat on a side street in D.C., tucked behind an aging library and a row of brownstone homes. No sign out front, no foot traffic, just a creaky wooden door, and behind it, silence that didn't demand anything. J.D. Vance stepped inside, pulled off his coat, and sat halfway down the center row. The pews were empty. The stained glass filtered afternoon light into faded slants of gold and violet. The air smelled faintly of dust and candle wax. His fingers rested on the worn wood in front of him, where someone before had scratched a name, Dottie, deep into the lacquer decades ago. He didn't pray. He didn't know how anymore. Not in the way people expected. But he closed his eyes and let his mind drift. Not toward the headlines or the committee invitations that had vanished, or the cold whispers of less divisive. It drifted backward. Farther. To the day his grandmother pawned her wedding ring. He was 18. First semester at Ohio State. His books for political theory and modern American history totaled more than he had in his bank account. His grandma hadn't even blinked. She'd reached into her dresser drawer, wrapped the ring in a piece of cloth, and said, "Go down to Pawn World. Don't let them give you less than 80. He remembered holding that ring like it was fire. It had been her only piece of jewelry, worn thin by years of housework, canning, cooking, holding the world together with blistered hands and a will sharper than steel. She never got it back. J.D. offered to buy it once, years later after his book deal. She smiled and said, "I already got the better return." And now here he was, a U.S. Senator, sitting in a pew with nothing but himself, and the sound of everything cracking open. It wasn't humiliation that brought the tears, not Crockett's jab, not the whispers, not even the subtle exile from political circles. It was what all of it revealed, that even after all the miles traveled, all the speeches given, all the suits worn, he was still seen as an intruder in the room, still the hillbilly, not the man who rose, still the symbol, not the soul. A drop of water landed on the wood below him, then another. He didn't sob, just breathed, hard and heavy, and let the tears move quietly, like grief that had waited years to be acknowledged. Was he angry? No, not quite. Not now. He was cracked open, and in that fracture came something else, a clarity that didn't ask permission. He realized then, the system didn't just fear poor kids from Middletown speaking out. It feared them remembering where they came from once they got in. It feared them telling the truth plainly, without spin. It feared memory, because memory could not be lobbied. It could not be packaged, and it certainly could not be silenced. J.D. sat up straighter, wiped his face. In the quiet, the dust swirled through a beam of light like fireflies. He didn't know what he'd do next. Not exactly. But it would not be rehearsed, not calculated, not about retribution. It would be about remembering. And maybe, just maybe, about restoring what dignity politics forgot. The envelope came in a stack of mail, wedged between a donor appeal and a glossy flyer for a think tank breakfast he was no longer invited to. No return address, just a first name, Mariah, and blocky high school handwriting. J.D. opened it out of instinct, not expectation. A single sheet of notebook paper, folded twice, ink slightly smudged like someone had rewritten a line or cried halfway through. "Dear Senator Vance, we watched your video in my civics class today. I didn't know white guys could be poor too. We live in a trailer in Arkansas, and people tell my mom we're lazy. I thought no one in government ever got what that feels like. But I saw it on your face. I believe you. I don't want to be invisible anymore." Mariah, age 16. J.D. stared at the letter for a long time. He didn't fold it back. He laid it flat on his kitchen table like evidence, like testimony, like scripture. There were statistics, charts, polls, campaign messages finely tuned by consultants. But this was real, and it burned with a kind of truth nothing scripted ever could. That night, J.D. turned on his old webcam. He didn't announce it, didn't send it to press, Just hit go live. His hair wasn't styled. The background was a faded Buckeyes blanket. He held Mariah's letter up to the camera, then gently set it down. He didn't name her, but he spoke like she was listening. I got a letter today from someone who doesn't feel seen. She wrote that she didn't know white guys could be poor too. I want to say this loud and clear. Pain doesn't have a party. It doesn't wear red or blue. It doesn't check your zip code or skin tone before it shows up at your door. It just arrives, quietly, forcefully. And if you're lucky, someone in power still remembers what it felt like. He paused, eyes steady, not trembling, not triumphant, just sure. I grew up in a house where the power got shut off. I've heard shame whisper through the walls, and I've seen people who've never missed a meal call it bootstraps while we boiled water to stay warm. So when someone tells me that I'm weaponizing sympathy, what they really mean is, stay in your lane, don't make us feel uncomfortable. But I'm not here to stay comfortable. I'm here to stay honest. The comment section was slow at first. A couple of rolling eyes, a handful of who cares. Then, my uncle cried watching this. I thought I was the only one who felt like that. My dad's been quiet for years. Tonight he showed me this and said, see, that's us. The views weren't explosive, not yet, but the resonance was atomic. In a small Arkansas town, Mariah sat in her room and watched the live stream twice. She didn't say much to anyone, but the next day she told her teacher, I think I want to work in politics someday. Not the fake kind, the kind that listens. And in D.C., J.D. Vance folded her letter, not to archive it, but to carry it, in his coat pocket, right over his heart. The folding chairs were mismatched. Some wobbled with the weight of time. Others still bore faded stickers from a long-forgotten church basement fundraiser. The podium wasn't really a podium at all, just a borrowed plastic table from the local rec center with a wobbly leg and a water bottle that kept tipping sideways. But nobody in that room cared, because every seat was full. Youngstown had grown used to visitors who arrived with promises and left with photo ops. Factories had shuttered. Hope had packed up and moved away. Politicians had come and gone, most never returning. But tonight felt different. J.D. Vance wasn't there to campaign. He didn't bring handlers or media crews. There were no flashing cameras, no prepared remarks. There was just J.D., a cheap microphone, and a story he hadn't dared speak aloud until now. He looked out over the audience, steel workers whose hands bore the memory of molten iron, nurses in rumpled scrubs, retired teachers in worn cardigans, and young fathers with tattoos fading under their flannel sleeves. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. Instead, he leaned into the moment, quietly. I want to read you something, he began. Something that was said to me on live television last week. Word for word. He pulled a wrinkled scrap of paper from his blazer pocket. You're the hillbilly they let in, so they can pretend to be inclusive. There was a sharp inhale across the room, as if everyone had swallowed their breath at once. He let the silence settle in. I didn't respond with anger, he continued, his voice low but steady, because anger's easy. I responded with roots, with memory, and maybe with something this country needs more of, reflection. He looked up, letting the moment land. But that doesn't mean it didn't cut. Near the back of the room, a woman stood. She wore a deep blue coat and a gray headscarf. Her voice, when it came, was firm, clear, and unshaking. Senator Vance, she said, I'm a black mother from the East Side. And what she said to you, that was ghetto in reverse. Now maybe you understand. J.D. didn't interrupt. He didn't retreat behind defensiveness. He just listened, eyes fixed on hers. She stepped closer. They've said I was too loud, too much, too angry, she continued. Used my voice as a weapon against me. But what she did to you, it's the same thing, just a different name on the package. There were murmurs around the room, soft nods, quiet affirmations. J.D. stepped down from the stage and walked toward her. They met in the middle and embraced. Not like politicians do, like people do, when something unspoken finally finds its voice. When the town hall ended, J.D. didn't rush out. He sat on the edge of the stage, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. People formed a slow line, not to ask for selfies or favors, but to speak their own truths. A coal miner who hadn't said a word at union meetings in years told JD, "I thought I was the only one tired of pretending we don't feel things." A teenage girl in a Walmart vest said in a hushed voice, "You made my dad cry. He don't cry." Someone handed JD a permanent marker and asked him to sign the plastic folding chair he'd used that night. By morning, that chair was mounted on the wall in the rec center lobby. Above it, a laminated sign bore the words, "Pain doesn't have a party. Truth doesn't need a podium." The next morning, the country awoke not to a scandal, but to a quiet shift in tone. It started with a headline, tucked between primary results and a celebrity divorce. In the op-ed section of the New York Times, "Respect across class lines begins with listening." The byline belonged to a Harvard professor of sociology, someone who had once written that populism was just rage with a suit on, but her tone had changed. In the column, she described watching J.D. Vance's Youngstown town hall 3 times. She quoted his exact words, emphasizing the lack of bitterness, the steadiness of tone. But most of all, she highlighted the moment when the Black mother stood and connected their experiences. Not as political adversaries, but as human beings who had both been told they didn't belong. Crockett threw a punch, the professor wrote, but what stunned America wasn't the insult. It was the way JD absorbed it, processed it, and handed it back without venom. And then came the quote that ricocheted across every morning show, Chiron, every Twitter thread, every late-night comedy segment. "They tried to shame my background. I built on it instead." It wasn't shouted, it wasn't defensive, it was just true. And in its simplicity, it cut deeper than any counterpunch could have. Cable news, usually allergic to subtlety, began replaying the town hall in full. The clip of JD reading Crockett's insult, followed by the hug in the center of that rec center, aired next to analysts saying things like, "We don't see this kind of political grace often, if ever." Within 24 hours, the Washington Post ran an article titled, "Hillbilly Elegy, Rewritten Live." Conservative blogs tried to spin it as a comeback story. Progressive voices debated whether Crockett had overstepped. But most people weren't reading pundits. They were reading each other. In Facebook groups for veterans, JD's words appeared next to photos of dusty boots and crumpled letters. On Reddit forums about poverty, JD's hug was posted with the caption, "This is how we should argue." Even teachers, once skeptical of JD's politics, shared clips with their civics students, captioning them, "When disagreement doesn't mean dehumanizing." JD didn't do a media tour. He didn't respond to the headlines. When reporters reached out for interviews, his team declined with a simple note. The message was meant for the people. They heard it. But back in his office, JD sat quietly, scrolling through screenshots of tweets and texts sent to him by his staff. One from a young woman in New Mexico read, "I used to think dignity was for people who never had to fight for it. Not anymore." He printed it out and pinned it beside his desk, next to an old Polaroid of his grandmother holding a chipped coffee mug. For once, the headlines didn't scream. They nodded. They acknowledged. They listened. And as JD looked at the wall, he thought, not with pride, but with a calm certainty, maybe this is how you rebuild a bridge. Not with steel or slogans, but with memory. The tides hadn't turned, but they had moved. And in politics, that was rare, precious, real. The invitation came wrapped in polish. A crisp email, a formal call from a network executive, a carefully worded proposal, a rematch, primetime, Vance versus Crockett, unfinished business. It was the kind of media moment any politician would crave. The spotlight, the buzz, the stage to settle the score. J.D. Vance read the email, then tapped the screen off. No reply. His phone buzzed again within the hour. This time, a producer, voice bright, rehearsed. "Senator Vance, we're offering equal time. You'll set your terms. Same table, same topic. America wants to see closure." J.D. smiled faintly, not from flattery but from recognition. He had seen this script before. Bright lights didn't reveal truth. They often masked it. He paused, then answered plainly, "I appreciate the invitation, but this isn't about spectacle anymore. Not for me." The producer stammered, tried to salvage it, but JD had already hung up. That same afternoon, he rerouted his schedule. No press, no aides, no optics team. He drove himself through rolling Kentucky hills until the GPS led him to a one-story brick building with peeling paint and a sign that read, Green Fork Food Collective. Inside, the air smelled of canned soup and dust. Volunteers stacked boxes, a few kids colored on the floor beside a donation bin. No one looked up when he entered. They didn't expect cameras, so they didn't expect him. He approached the front desk. A woman in a faded Support Appalachian Families shirt gave him a tired smile. Name? She asked automatically. He hesitated, then answered, JD. She squinted. The JD? He shrugged. Just here to help, or listen. They didn't need help packing boxes. What they needed were working fridges, consistent funding, and someone who understood what it meant when a mother quietly skipped meals for her kids. JD didn't speak much. He followed a young man named Travis through the aisles. Travis explained how some families couldn't even afford gas to come pick up food, how others were too embarrassed to show up in daylight. At one point, a middle-aged woman with a worn denim jacket stopped him. She had been staring since he walked in. You're him, aren't you? JD nodded. She didn't say thank you or offer a selfie. Instead, she whispered, You said pain doesn't have a party. That stuck. He nodded again, slower this time. She added, It's easy to clap back on TV. It's harder to show up here. That night, JD sat in the parking lot long after the last box had been handed out. The building behind him glowed with the last light of purpose. Not pride, not performance. Just purpose. He looked out at the fields beyond. No cameras, no applause. And yet it felt louder than anything that had ever been aired. Somewhere inside his mind, the debate stage faded. The viral clip quieted. In its place stood the faces from that food bank. The soft-spoken mother, the tough-skinned teen, the volunteer with the cracked voice. He didn't need another debate. He needed this. Not to win, to understand. The auditorium wasn't grand. No marble columns, no velvet seats, just rows of plastic chairs lined in military formation under flickering fluorescent lights. The podium bore a plastic seal that read, Eastern Appalachian Community College. It was modest, like the people it served. And that was precisely why J.D. Vance had said yes. There were no press releases, no national coverage, just a printed flyer taped to walls across campus. Guest speaker, Senator J.D. Vance, speaking on class, grit, and American identity. At 6:03 p.m., he walked in. Some students looked up in vague recognition. Others tapped on phones, disinterested. The room wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. A few professors stood at the back, arms crossed. Skepticism floated in the air like chalk dust. JD stood behind the podium, eyes level, hands unclenched. No cue cards, no teleprompter. Just a folded piece of paper in his jacket he never pulled out. He began not with thunder, but with a question. What do they think of when they hear hillbilly? A few students glanced at each other. No one answered. He nodded slowly. I'll tell you, they think broken. They think uneducated. They think dangerous. His voice didn't rise. It settled in like gravel under boot soles. But here's what they don't see. It was my mama's hand that kept the lights on. It was nights sleeping 3 to a room, using duct tape to keep the cold out. It was going to work at 14 and reading legal dictionaries at midnight. And none of it made me less American. Some heads tilted, phones slipped into pockets. They say hillbilly like it's a curse, but it taught me how to fight without raising a fist. Silence. He looked around, held the pause. When someone calls you a name on national TV, you learn real fast what kind of strength matters. The strength to not shout back. The strength to remember that where you're from is not a punchline. It's a place people survive, hope, rebuild. Every damn day. He looked to the back of the room. I didn't come here for applause. I came here because I needed to say this out loud once. And because someone out there is wondering if being poor, rural, or unfashionable makes them invisible. Still no claps. Then a rustle. One student, black, flannel shirt, worn notebook on his lap, stood up. Then another. A girl in a community nursing badge. Then more. Not cheering, just standing. One by one, they rose. JD didn't move, didn't smile, just looked out and let the silence wrap around them. It wasn't ovation, it was understanding. The professor in the back nodded slowly, arms uncrossed. Someone recorded a clip, but the moment wasn't for going viral. It was for the kid in the third row whose father once said, "College isn't for people like us." It was for the girl whose accent had been mocked in a freshman seminar. It was for the ones who knew the sting of being underestimated. JD folded his hands behind the podium. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes you just need to remember who you are and say it out loud. He stepped away. No music, no confetti, just a few tears that no one apologized for. That night, as he walked to his truck, he passed two students talking. One asked, "You think he meant all that?" The other answered, "Didn't matter." He showed up. And that, JD thought, was enough. Not to win votes, but to matter. It started in a quiet corner of the internet. No headlines, no celebrity retweets, just a single photo. A close-up of a wrist, pale skin slightly reddened from fresh ink. Beneath the curve of the bone, in soft, steady script, read the words, "Survival is not shame." The caption said, "He said this in a college speech." It healed something in me. At first, no one knew who he was, but within hours, the quote began to echo. A high school guidance counselor reposted it, adding, "Showed this to a girl afraid to ask for lunch money. She cried." A former Marine added it to the bio of a mental health vlog. Then a nurse in Birmingham posted a video, pointing at her scrubs. This isn't just a job, it's how I kept my lights on. Survival is not shame. The hashtag caught fire. Hashtag silent strength, not loud, not angry, just real. For days, JD didn't know it was happening. He'd gone off-grid for a weekend, driving alone through the back roads of Appalachia, stopping in towns that didn't get C-SPAN coverage. He wanted distance, from debates, from optics, from the constant loop of people telling him who he was supposed to be. On a Monday morning, he stepped into a small barbershop in Hazard, Kentucky. It was the kind of place where the chairs creaked, the walls had faded posters of classic boxers, and the radio played gospel between static. He waited his turn, nodding to a young man in a cape already in the chair. Then he saw it. Taped to the mirror in front of the first chair was a flyer-sized poster. It was printed on plain paper. No branding, no logos, just black text in centered font. Survival is not shame. And below it, handwritten in marker, hashtag silent strength. He stared for a moment too long. The barber noticed. "You seen that one before?" the man asked, turning off the buzzer. JD smiled faintly, almost caught. "I might have heard it once." "Powerful stuff," the barber nodded. "My nephew printed that off. Said some senator said it in a speech. Wasn't yelling, just telling the truth." JD nodded slowly, as if processing it for the first time. "Yeah," he said, "that sounds about right." Later that week, a local news anchor covered the trend. No big national splash, but enough that one journalist called JD's office for comment. His statement was brief. "If a line I said gave someone a little more dignity when they looked in the mirror, that's worth more than any headline. We all come from somewhere. We all carry something. Survival's not shame, it's a story worth telling." That quote would later be etched into dozens of locker walls, classroom doors, church bulletins. But JD never tried to own it. He didn't trademark it, didn't repost it. He just kept moving, visiting food banks, mentoring veterans, speaking in community colleges where no one asked for autographs. Sometimes someone would recognize him in a diner, eyes wide, saying, "You're the one who said it." He'd nod politely. But inside he thought, it's not about who said it, it's about who needed to hear it. And on nights when doubt crept in, when the headlines still twisted his name, when critics painted him as both too soft and too sharp, he'd remember that one girl, the one who tattooed his words into her skin, not for decoration, but for survival. That was the moment he knew. Not all revolutions are loud. Some begin with a whisper and stay with you forever. It had been months since JD last stepped foot into the garage, the one behind his mother's house in Middletown, Ohio. The place hadn't changed. Dust still floated lazily through beams of sunlight, slipping through warped wooden panels. The faint smell of rust and motor oil lingered, mixing with the sharp crispness of autumn in the air. A stack of old campaign boxes leaned in one corner. A worn-out stool sat in another, exactly where he left it. He didn't come back here for nostalgia. He came for clarity. JD took out his phone, propped it against a stack of paint cans, and hit record. No crew, no ring light, just his voice and four dusty walls that had seen his beginnings, and now the aftermath of his unraveling. He stared into the camera for a beat, then spoke slowly. "They wanted me quiet," he began, voice steady. "But silence isn't peace. It's just absence." His hand lightly touched the edge of the table behind him, once used for everything from fixing lawnmowers to scribbling college essays. He looked down, collected his breath, then locked eyes with the lens. "I've been called a name meant to flatten people like me. Hillbilly, trash, token. But to anyone who's ever been shamed for where you're from, build anyway." The air felt heavier now, not with pressure, but with truth. He continued, "This garage, it's where I figured out I could matter, even if no one thought I would. I've been laughed at, pitied, even used as a punchline. But every bruise built a backbone. Every silence taught me how to listen. There was no script, just what lived in his chest. You don't have to shout to be heard," he said softly. "You just have to speak when it matters." He paused again, letting the weight of those words settle like the dust around him. Then, as if speaking to someone just outside the frame, he added, "If you're watching this and thinking you're too small, too late, too poor, or too different, just remember, I started here. I started right here, and so can you." He reached forward and turned off the recording. No applause, no staffers, no plan to post it immediately. But in that moment, J.D. Vance wasn't a senator or a headline or a symbol caught between political battlegrounds. He was a boy from Middletown who came back to the place where his voice first found roots. And now, once again, it was rising, not for spectacle, but for legacy. The envelope was handwritten in careful, looping script, the kind only a teenager trying to make a good impression would use. It sat among policy briefs and donor updates on JD's desk in D.C., standing out not for what it said on the outside, but for what it didn't. No return address, just a single word in blue ink. Kiara. He opened it slowly, as if the paper itself was fragile. Inside was a folded sheet of lined notebook paper, soft with wear, its creases nearly torn. At the top, in bold pencil, were the words, "For the senator who reminded me." It was a poem. They called you names like weeds on a wall. But you stood still and made the bricks remember. They laughed on air, but you spoke in dust, and I saw my father's silence turn into something strong. They called you weak, but you answered with memory, and I heard myself in you. J.D. didn't move for a moment after reading it. His thumb lingered on the edge of the page, tracing the uneven pencil pressure. The spots where the lines had been pressed harder, maybe out of passion or anger or courage, maybe all three. He imagined Kiara somewhere in Alabama, sitting at a kitchen table or under a flickering ceiling fan, watching his garage video not as politics, but as poetry, as possibility. Reaching for a note card from his drawer, he didn't draft a statement or dictate to staff. He wrote in his own handwriting, short, direct, but deeply felt. "Kiara, they may try to edit you, your voice, your past, your rhythm. Don't let them, ever." He signed it simply, Jake D. Before placing it in the envelope, he looked at her poem again. That final line stayed with him, "And I heard myself in you." It wasn't just flattery, it was a mirror. And for the first time in weeks, JD realized he wasn't trying to win something anymore. He was trying to protect something. Folding the letter carefully, he added a postscript. P.S. When you write your next one, send me a copy. As the envelope sealed with the quiet pull of adhesive, JD smiled. Not because the story had ended, but because it had echoed, in places he never expected, in voices he didn't know were listening. And just like that, a girl in Alabama had reminded him why he ever spoke at all. The morning air wrapped Capitol Hill in a faint chill, the kind that makes silence feel heavier, more intentional. J.D. Vance walked alone beneath the pale blush of dawn, his shoes echoing softly against the stone path. No aides, no reporters, no camera flashes. Just him and the quiet hum of a city that rarely paused. But today it seemed to. He moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with purpose. Each step felt like a punctuation mark to the long sentence his life had been writing since that night on the debate stage. The place that once felt like a battlefield now felt like a bookend. In that stillness, his voice came to him, not spoken aloud, but settled deep within, the way memory sometimes does. They had called it weakness, his calm, his restraint, the way he didn't fight back with fury. But he knew better. It wasn't weakness, it was memory. Every insult carried the weight of a past he never denied, and every quiet breath had been earned. They said it was pity, but it had never been that. It was pride, the quiet, unshakable pride of someone who knew where he came from and chose not to hide it. And when he finally spoke, not loud, not theatrical, just clear and steady, something in the room shifted. They heard him. Not just his words, but what stood behind them. A childhood lit by garage bulbs, a grandmother's sacrifice, a hunger not just for food, but for dignity. He reached the top of the Capitol steps and stood still, watching the sun edge its way across the marble facade. For the first time in a long time, there was no need to explain himself. The moment had already spoken. And as he turned away and began his descent, a final thought settled into place like a quiet truth. Power isn't just who speaks first, it's who refuses to be silenced. This story reminds us that strength isn't always loud. It can live in stillness, in the choice not to strike back, but to speak from truth. J.D. Vance's journey shows how dignity can rise from insult, and how a moment of restraint can echo louder than outrage. In an age of constant noise, his silence became a statement. What began as a personal attack became a public reckoning with class, identity, and respect. Sometimes the most powerful response is not revenge, but reflection. What about you? Have you ever turned a moment of pain into a message of purpose? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.